ahead and start the recording. Okay, great. Michelle, I'll turn it over to you now to get started.
Okay, thank you. There's two things I wanted to cover tonight. The first is to talk generally about zoning text amendment 2502 and give sort of a high level overview of what it is, how it works, and how it is distinguished from a number of the major proposals that were formally put forward in the Attainable Housing Strategies Initiative put out by the Planning Board. And the other thing that I'd like to do, the planning staff has issued a staff report making some recommendations with respect to the zoning text amendment. It's fairly lengthy. I think it's close to 30 pages just dealing with this zoning text amendment. The planning board's hearing is this Thursday, the 6th. It is, I think, going to be a challenge to present meaningful testimony on that, given that it was such a short turnaround. But there are several recommendations in there that I would like to bring to your attention so that you can have them in your mind when you prepare your testimony for the county council. So, big picture, the proposed zoning text amendment differs from the attainable housing in that it is not a county-wide initiative. It does not apply throughout entire zones, which the prior approach had done. Instead, it focuses on corridors, certain defined corridors, roadways within Montgomery County. And the way those corridors are defined is a minimum of 100 feet of a master planned right of way, and with a minimum of 3 built lanes. So one question that has come up a number of times is about that 100 feet. It's not whether or not 100 feet, it's not about whether a roadway is 100 feet wide. The question is, does the master plan recommend the final right-of-way width to be 100 feet? It's a very confusing standard because they reference boulevards and different road designations, but the council has put out a map that shows where those corridors are located and also attempts to identify on a lot by lot basis which properties would be considered eligible. The approach in this case is not a global rezoning of entire zones, but rather presents what's called an optional method of development. That optional method means in order to move forward with the types of housing that are identified in this zone, you have to meet certain standards. Broadly described, you have to provide at least 15% workforce housing. And that workforce housing standard is not set out in the zoning ordinance. It is set out in Chapter 25B of the county code, which is the county's housing policy. Essentially, it requires that the workforce housing units that would make a development eligible would have to be rent restricted or sale restricted in certain specific ways. So the density changes of this bill compared with as distinguished from what had been proposed in the attainable housing, there are several different types of housing units that could be approved. The first is a duplex. The second would be a triplex. The third are townhouses. Townhouses are defined as 4 or more housing units with vertical walls. And the fourth would be apartments. And apartments are essentially 4 or more units with horizontal walls that could be split. And, we would be talking apartments or condominiums. So this zoning text amendment does introduce new housing types, and they would be required to go through site plan review before the planning board. That's a significant difference from the Attainable Housing Initiative, which basically would have allowed a developer to go by right, just have the right to move forward to building permit. This does not allow that. This requires a site plan level of review, which means signage, public notice, a hearing before the planning board, and an opportunity for public comment. So that's the narrowing of eligible lots to those along a corridor and the imposition of a site plan level of review are two very, very significant changes from the attainable housing initiative. That having been said, there are some concerns, or at least issues that have been raised as questions. The zoning text amendment is not clear that as to whether or not you can assemble properties. If you could, for example, take 2 or 3 or 4 lots side by side along a corridor, can you assemble them into one single lot through a subdivision process and in effect eliminate the setbacks that otherwise would constrain density, and instead, for example, build one long string of townhomes or an apartment unit an apartment building that would achieve greater density than if you just segmented it into 4 separate lots, each with its own setback. Councilmember Friedson in public hearings has said that it is not the intent of this legislation that assemblage could occur. I don't see anything in the law that would prohibit that. And the staff at Park and Planning reads the law in the same way. The same question applies to properties that front on a corridor, and then there being a property behind it that maybe either is sandwiched between several lots or has frontage on a neighborhood street to the back. And Councilmember Friedson has said that if you have frontage on a neighborhood street, that you're not eligible for this optional method of development. Again, if a developer were to assemble those 2 lots and have then a long, narrow lot with one fronting on a corridor and one fronting on a neighborhood street, I don't see anything in the law that prohibits that. And I share the same concern with respect to a corner lot. Many corner lots have access on neighborhood streets, which makes them, in theory, ineligible, but I don't see that clearly stated in the law. So those are clarifications that I think need to be addressed in future amendments, because while we hear what the intent of the legislation is, those intentions have not clearly carried over into the way that it's written. One other issue that I just would like to raise for purposes of your own internal discussion, although a duplex currently is allowed in the R40 zone, it is not allowed in the R60, R90, or R200 zones. Under this ZTA, it is a permissible type of dwelling unit in those zones. It does not require workforce housing. So unlike a triplex, townhouse, or apartment complex, it does not have any affordable housing requirement attached to it. So a developer could come in and build 2 market unit rates in those zones without having to provide workforce housing. For each of the other types of housing, there is a minimum 15% workforce housing requirement. For example, a triplex has a requirement that at least one of the 3 units be affordable. So that's the maximum height limit is 40 feet. By and large, the other kinds of setbacks, lot coverage, a parking standards in this zoning text amendment mirror the standards of the underlying zones. There are some minor deviations, but nothing significant to speak of. There are these other assemblage questions, I think, for example, and which lots actually are eligible are more significant issues. So that's a lot of talking. And I know there's a lot in the bill. I think those are the highlights of the difference between this and the attainable housing uh, proposal. And it may be, I'm happy to answer questions. If you have questions you'd like to present, and then I can go through the staff recommendations after we talk about the bill specifically.
Do we have to put our question in the chat, or can we just speak it to you?
I would much prefer you speak it.
Can
Okay.
you raise your hands, please?
Or perhaps somebody can read questions in the chat, but it's easier for me.
Where do you put the hand up?
Oh, you don't know how to do that. Who is
No,
that?
I don't see it. I see chat, I see react, I see participants. I don't see
It's
hands.
React. Click on React.
All right.
Reactions, yes.
Yeah, do you see it? Oh, that's applause. Sorry.
Okay, I see that Leanne Tobias has a question. Go ahead. Leanne.
Michele, could you possibly go over the point again about the lot sandwiched between other lots? That needs to.
Sure. It goes to the question of whether or not a lot has to be developed by itself, or can a lot be combined with a lot that has frontage on a corridor? So, for example, you might have a lot that has a corner lot with frontage along a corridor, and then a side street. I'll just call it side street. So if you have a frontage lot, a corner lot, and then another lot that is only facing the side street, could you assemble all three of those? Or could you go back even further to the opposing corner lot and assemble, say, 4 lots? And so from a land use perspective, if you can combine more property and re-subdivide that into a single lot, you eliminate the setbacks that would otherwise apply, and you have more flexibility to build larger units. So that's the concern. And I don't see anything in the code that prohibits that kind of assemblage.
Okay. And the planning department has said the same thing. Is that
The planning
correct?
the planning department agrees that that is the way the law would be read. Yes.
Okay.
We have a question here in the chat. Someone did put in first and asked me to read. It says, amazingly, the map showing the properties include those along 20-foot service road. These properties are not fronting on the corridor roadway. Planning appears to accept these properties under the ZTA. Service roads normally serve the homes with necessary on-street parking, making the road very congested. It's not really a question, I guess it's a statement, but can you comment on service roads that are, the house is not on the corridor, but there's a service road?
That seems to me a mistake, because a service road would not have a master planned right of way of 100 feet unless that service road is, and the other requirement is that whatever frontage road is serving as the corridor has to have at least 3 travel lanes actually constructed. So if that's how that's showing, I would bring that to the attention of Councilmember Friedson's office and ask him that question, because it sounds to me like somebody made a mistake.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Jerry Garson, you're next.
My question concerns the townhouses that they want to build. At the moment, we see most townhouses do not have any fireproofing between the units. So if one unit catches fire, they all catch fire. We're now seeing wildfires spreading in that. Can there be a requirement that there be some fireproofing between the units in townhouses so the fires don't spread to the entire neighborhood? Or is it too late?
That is a building code issue, not a a zoning issue. I would suggest that you contact the Department of Permitting Services and ask that question. My understanding is that for townhouses, there are firewalls between the units, but I am not an architect. I'm not a building expert. And that issue would be addressed in the building code, not the zoning code. I would call 311, ask to talk to somebody in the Department of Permitting Services and ask them that question directly. And it's also a question you might want to email to Councilmember Friedson and get his response as well.
I do have one additional comment. I don't know if you're aware, as of midnight tonight or midnight tomorrow, there's going to be a 25% tariff on all lumber coming from Canada, and almost all lumber that is used in houses in this area does come from Canada. So I guess housing will be 25% more expensive starting tomorrow or the next day.
Okay, Jerry, we're doing questions on the bill, please. David, you're next. I think you're muted, David. Hang on, you're muted. There you go.
Can you hear me?
Now we can, yes.
All right. So I have 3 quick points. In my neighborhood association, someone told me that they feel that there'd be plenty of room for workforce housing in the up county rather than lower Old Georgetown Road, which borders our Wingate neighborhood. So it doesn't seem like that's been considered. And can you comment on that first? Then I have 2 others.
I cannot give you an explanation for why the council has chosen the corridors that it has chosen. Some of this is up county. There are corridors, I believe, up in the Germantown area. There's at least one out in the Darnestown area. But as to why they are placed where they are placed and how they were selected, that's a question for the people who put together the ZTA. I can't tell you why they picked what they picked.
Okay. Next question. On converting half-empty commercial buildings into residential, they've made this, for one thing, quote unquote, expedited. And also, they're giving a 25-year tax holiday to any developer that would do this. And only 15% has to be quote unquote workforce housing. Is there any reason why it has to be 25 years of free of taxes? And maybe the requirement of 15% should be more than that.
I don't know why they chose the 15% requirement. I can tell you that a presentation that Councilmember Friedson gave last week, he said that he took the 25-year tax relief term and based it off of a similar bill in the District of Columbia, which has a 40-year tax relief provision. So he felt that was excessive and pared it back to 25. Whatever number you pick, it's a judgment call. But his explanation, if I understood him correctly, was to look at another piece of legislation that was similar and scale it to what he thought was appropriate for this jurisdiction.
Okay. Final question. I did look at the staff report from the planning board, and I saw that they do mention a few things like climate impact and things like that. But they really don't seem to address the impact on the infrastructure along these corridors and what it would mean for needing schools, needing parking, needing services such as fire, police, ambulance, and more road impact and cut through traffic in adjacent neighborhoods. None of that seems to be addressed, and wouldn't there be some requirement that they should address these things before being allowed to build?
There are two staff reports that are out right now. One is an assessment of the climate change impact of this bill, and the other is a broader analysis of the zoning text amendment itself. The climate impact recommendations are fairly limited. They do recommend that there be a ban on waiver of on-site stormwater managements. Currently, small lots can get a waiver of managing their stormwater runoff on site. Staff has looked to the county's climate change policy document and said that that should not be allowed. Now, that may or may not be something that can be addressed in the zoning text amendment, but they do recognize that there are serious stormwater runoff implications, particularly in the down county area. So they are making that recommendation. They also are recommending more lenient standards for planting trees in streetscapes and within properties to try and help augment tree plantings in light of this. Their third climate change recommendation, however, I think would raise concerns for a lot of communities, and that would be to reduce the on-site parking requirement from 2 on-site parking spaces to 1. And their justification for that is that it would reduce impervious coverage on a particular property and allow for more green space and more tree planting. From my perspective, the concern would be that you then will have more overflow parking in the adjoining existing communities. I think that many of these corridors have limited, if any, parking, certainly during rush hours and perhaps at other times as well, depending on how constrained they are. And that seems to me a recommendation that's going to drive adverse impacts within the communities. With respect to questions like the schools and traffic generally, there is no express obligation for the council to have conducted studies on the impact of this proposal on that existing infrastructure. Do I think that as a matter of as basically custodians of public health, safety, welfare, do I think it's the responsible thing for them to do? I do think it's the responsible thing for them to do. And I think those are comments and questions that are very fairly put forward to them in this upcoming public hearing process.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Who's next?
Somebody announcing who's next?
Irvin Lieberman.
I'm sorry, Irving Lieberman.
Good evening. Thanks for coming to speak with us. I wanted to point out a couple of things. Somebody mentioned it in the chat, but we've also mentioned it in previous meetings, that the Little Falls Library site is also designated as a county-owned site that might be eligible for this type of redevelopment. The librarian there tells me that 25,000 items a month are checked out. It's a very heavily used community resource. And if you go there after 3 o'clock when Westland gets out, that library is full of teenagers who go there to do homework together, to do research. They talk to the librarian. The idea that that library might be at risk is an outrageous imposition on the neighborhood. And I don't know where the council would even dream that that should be an acceptable impact of this. Another thing before I get to my question is, you mentioned that there'd be a 40-foot height limit on the larger dwellings that could be built on these optional method lot permits. But actually, I think it's 40 in our neighborhood in West Haven. I think it's 40 feet now. A few houses have been built to that limit, and they dwarf everything else that's in the neighborhood. This would extend that, as Councilman Friedson said in a previous meeting, it would be only 5 feet more. It would be 45 feet. That would accommodate a five-story building in a neighborhood full of 2-story residences. It's ridiculously out of scale for the neighborhood. To say it's only 5 feet more, it's 5 feet more than an existing limit that's already too tall for the neighborhood. And what I'd like to ask is, with White Flint that can accommodate hundreds, if not a few thousand units, sitting vacant for years, and with the Geico site will soon be designated for reuse. Geico is moving to one of those tall towers in Bethesda put up by the car company. With sites like those, either available or soon to be available, what is the need to invade neighborhoods and impose apartment buildings on a corridor? It may be technically 100 feet wide, but Massachusetts Avenue has one bus going on it. It is not a mass transit zone. So you're sort of using this technicality of 100 feet, which maybe it is 100 feet. It doesn't look like it to me. But why is that the determinant as opposed to the availability of mass transit and also utilizing existing sites, land sites that would accommodate far more housing? You're going to be like disrupting neighborhoods to put up a triplex here, a duplex there. It's like ruining the neighborhood without a substantial impact on the affordable housing shortage. So it's kind of like we're witnessing this onslaught in our neighborhood of, first it was Westbard out of scale, then it was Little Falls Parkway, that they start calling a horizontal or a linear park when there's already a linear park 50 feet to the west of it. And now it's like this relentless attack on our neighborhoods close in by the council with these harebrained schemes. What is going on with this? You can't go 6 months without having to attend a series of meetings to stop them from doing another outrageous thing to the neighborhood.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Irving. Go ahead, Michelle.
Well, a White Flint came up at one of the recent discussions. I think that I I honestly have not tracked what's going on with the White Flint development. I think it has been upzoned for significant redevelopment. I think whatever is happening there is happening between private parties. I have no idea what's happening with the Little Falls Library site. It seems to me if the current occupant is not willing to change use, it's not like the county can come in and force you to make a change. It has to be with the consent of the property owner itself. And as far as why isn't the county rezoning other areas that may be more favorable for significantly more housing, I can't answer that question. I just can't. That's a question that's fairly directed at your legislators. It's fairly something that's certainly fair to present as a question at the public hearing. But I wish I could tell you the mindset, but I can't. I'm just not privy to that.
Okay, Rebecca Hanson.
Thank you. And thank you, Michelle, for doing this. I'm co-president of the Westmoreland Citizens Association.
Sure.
Yeah, we have almost 1,000 homes, and we straddle Massachusetts Avenue between Little Falls Parkway and Westmoreland Circle. And my question is, while it sounds encouraging that this development cannot happen by right anymore, I would like you to, based on your experience, is it meaningful as a practical matter, to say that the site plan needs to be reviewed in front of the planning board and there's an opportunity for public comment? I mean, what obligation does the planning board have to put, or is this just another way to waste people's time and be ignored?
The role of the planning board is to make sure that the project meets the standards of the zoning code. There's a master plan finding requirement that you wouldn't have if you just went straight to building permit. But assuming the developer meets the objective standards of the zone, then there really is very little that the planning board can do. And the standards applicable here are really very largely objective. How many feet tall, how many feet for a side setback, that kind of thing. The one thing it does offer is the opportunity for the community to come in and testify. You get to know what's happening in your community before a shovel goes in the ground. Might not sound like much, but it's certainly more than you would have had under the other. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you that a site plan review process is going to necessarily result in a denial. In most instances, it doesn't, because the developer will come in compliance with those objective standards.
Yeah. So that was my sense, that it sounds like a meaningless right of participation on our part, really. Okay.
And to some degree, the participation is certainly important. The other piece of it, though, is that you at least know about it ahead of time.
Okay. Thank you.
Deborah Gonski.
Hi, I'm Deborah Gonski. I'm the president of the Stonegate Citizens Association. We're in East County, District 5. We have a lot of concerns here because we're one of the places where you actually have somewhat affordable single-family homes.
Right.
Right. Somewhat, our average is definitely below in price. And that what we think will happen is that, we will lose our whole corridors. I'm right off of New Hampshire Avenue, just for everybody, if you know where that is, State Route 650. And a lot of people here are very concerned about what could happen to their houses, and also the prices, what we've seen here in East County anyway, and certainly by the Glenmont Metro Station, is they're not putting in any kind of workforce or missing middle. Let's not even call it affordable housing, like luxury townhomes are what's going in. And we think that that's basically what's going to push through New Hampshire Avenue and displace people who would rather have, a single home. And that's our concern with this.
I can't argue with that.
Okay.
If you've got a 15% workforce housing component, then one would assume that most, if not all, of the other units are going to be market rate. And we all have seen townhouses that, are very, very expensive. So I think the rationale is that if you provide more houses, eventually it's going to drive the price down. But I'm not an economist. I don't know what the impact of this will be.
Thank you. We also have another shopping center, like like everybody else, where Sears went out of business. So we're right there with you. We'd rather, that be a target of this. And I guess the only other comment I had or question is, do you think also the 15% requirement for workforce housing sort of came out of the MPDU program, or like why not 25%?
It's different.
Okay.
I don't know why they came up with that as the percentage, but it is a different, the MPDU program targets people who are at a lower income strata. And this one is the AMI. It's escaping me for the moment, but it's a higher level of income that's eligible for this. So it is trying to sort of broaden the spectrum of people who can't necessarily afford housing, but would be in a position to buy or rent at a higher level. How they came up with the 15%, I'm not sure.
No, thank you. I mean, I definitely, we all have our 20-somethings living at home with us here for, some of the same reasons. So thank you very much.
I have a couple of questions. One is commercial uses in these properties. There's someone in the chat saying they're in the University Boulevard corridor plan, which is recommended for a mixture of, I think, commercial, residential. And I think I saw in this More Housing Now, some daycares or maybe some ancillary uses. So can you explain all that, what we could expect besides people living in the houses?
Sure. There's two components to that. One of them is to say that you can have ancillary non-residential uses. Think daycare or dental office, or those other kinds of conditional use, either low impact home use, low impact home occupation, or conditional use. A lot of those are going to be foreclosed just because of parking limitations, or, for example, daycare limitations on how much square footage you have to have per student. But it's certainly a possibility. And so that, I think, is something that has been a bit of concern for people because it allows for a further intensification of that use. That's one piece that is in the bill. The other piece, right now, apartments are allowed to have up to 10% service or retail use. One of the recommendations from the planning staff is that if you are developed under this optional method, that retail service uses should not be allowed in that apartment building. So there's two different kinds of things. One is sort of the conditional use home occupation, which applies across the board. The other is service retail in the apartment.
Okay. And then my other question has to do with curb cuts and entrance and exit to these sort of developments. I know from working on a completely different project on Georgia Avenue, the state doesn't really like a lot of curb cuts on busy roads because it slows traffic down. So are we going to get service roads like, there are blocks like we have it in our neighborhood where it's part of it is on Georgia, and then there are houses behind it on the street behind it, but there's no street in between. So, if you turn on the side street, are we going to get service roads between houses and townhouses? Or how would you expect, or does it say how they're going to have traffic entering these units?
It doesn't specifically say. Now, right now, the way it's written, I believe that you would be using the curb cut to the corridor. I'd like to talk to you a little bit more this week about the service road issue because I really have not seen that in the areas where I've been focused on, where my attention's been focused. But right now, you need to have frontage on a corridor, and you should be using that curb cut, whether it's where it is now or shifted slightly. I do have some concerns that if you're going to assemble properties, are you going to have multiple curb cuts? Or is State Highway going to require you to reduce it to one? But honestly, I don't know the specific answer to the question that you're asking about service roads.
Okay, it looks like Kevin Bromberg is next.
Right. Hi there. Thanks, Michele,
Hi,
for
Kevin.
doing this. So my question is about assembling properties. So let's say you're on the corridor and you're going to assemble 3 or 4 properties. Let's say it's 5 townhomes. What are the applicable setbacks, lot coverage, and heights and parking for, let's say, 5 homes in a row?
All right, so let's say you assemble 5 lots and you're in the R90 zone, and you eliminate those internal lot lines. The height limit would still be 40 feet, and the side and rear setbacks would still be the same side and rear setbacks that you would have for any single lot. They don't change. And your parking restrictions would remain the same. It's just that by eliminating the setbacks that you ordinarily would have between those units, you can achieve more density because you can now have a building across where those internal setback limits would have been.
So I'm not sure I understand. So if there's still side setbacks, and now it'll be across the 5 buildings. So it's the same setback on the sides that one unit would have had,
The setback would, so if you've got
side setbacks.
here and you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, right? You'd have setbacks from each of those internal lines. But if you make this just one big lot, then your setback would be from this side and from this side.
So if it was 15 today, it still would be 15 on this longer edge.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And the parking, what happens to the parking for 5 townhomes? What's the requirement?
There, right now, it would be 2 parking spaces on site per unit. Planning staff is recommending that be reduced to 1 parking spot per unit.
Where
There
can I
is an
put 5?
attachment.
So where would I
And
put 5?
that's a great question. And actually, there is an attachment to the staff report for this Thursday's hearing, and it shows parking layouts for duplex, triplex, townhouse and apartments. And so I couldn't begin to explain it to you verbally. It's just one or two sheets. If you go on the planning board's website, it is one of those exhibits, and it's very helpful to look at that.
I assume you would say this would create great difficulties for parking and traffic if they tried to put 5 parking units behind these townhomes and have people move in and out and around.
And that's why it's helpful to look at the layout that they have. It typically, all parking spaces need to be behind the front line of the building. So it can't be in the front yard. So generally you get sort of like a driveway and then a wraparound with parking in the back. But again, you'd need to take a look at those layouts to get a better understanding.
And later, I'd like to see where we can find the staff report. If you send us all the link, because I could not find it. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Rohit, Kana, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, Michelle, for taking the time to talk to us today. I'm going to try to put you on the spot here. The ZTA as currently drafted, could it expose the county to lawsuits similar to what happened in Arlington County?
I think that that's highly unlikely. And the reason is the lawsuit in Arlington County was based on that jurisdiction's failure to follow county and state law in certain studies they were required to conduct, in certain analysis they were required to prepare. And so the court found that procedurally it had to go back because it hadn't been implemented properly. In this case, I don't see any basis at the moment that the county hasn't acted properly. Unlike Virginia, we don't have the same state law requirements for the type of more in-depth analysis that's required in Virginia, which is one reason why the council has been able to introduce this legislation without the kinds of analysis on traffic, school, stormwater that has been raised earlier in this meeting.
Sherry Weiss.
Hi, I'm Sherry Steisel-Weiss. I'm the president of the Lux Manor Citizens Association. And I want to thank you and thank Cheryl for putting this all together. Incredibly valuable. And I just want to start with just related to curb cuts. We're on Old Georgetown Road between Tuckerman and Tilden Lane, where we have basically 7 properties, which would be 7 curb cuts with the bike lanes and potentially the BRT coming through. How would that work for what is 3 lanes and for movement of traffic? We're sort of racking our brains because they've said we definitely have the 3 lanes from the questions we've asked, despite bike lanes and medians. But how could you possibly have people moving back and forth and a major school, the new Woodward Elementary School, and still be able to move in and out?
Beats me. I'm sorry. I don't have an answer for that. I have no
So
idea.
we're going to raise that in our testimony, but I want to
I
ask.
think that's right.
I mean, I think it's a practical matter. It's kind of ridiculous. But then in addition to that, okay, so in the housing staff's recommendations, they talk about the climate adaptation action development standards, and they were not addressed for multifamily, for stormwater, for 3 and 4 multiplex buildings. So do you have suggestions of how we might address this and push both 2 issues in stormwater? First, to get the stormwater, there has to be an applicable standard for these multiplex buildings. And the second would be ensuring they can't be waived. Could you talk to both of those?
Sure. If there are not standards or if it's unclear what they are, then that merits a question. I mean, I think part of the benefit of the public hearing is to raise these questions. What is lacking? With respect to the waiver issue, in the planning department's climate assessment staff report, they reference the county's own climate policy document, which recommends that there not be waivers of stormwater management. And so I think you can look to that and use the county's own policy to support that position.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Sure. Mhm.
Okay, Leanne Tobias, do you have a question? Harry Lamari?
Michelle, I want to make sure I understand this. I have two questions, but they're somewhat related. Number one, with the optional method, what I've noticed in West Bud, for example, was because of the provision of community amenities by the developer, substantial upzoning was permitted. Can they do that in this legislation to go beyond the 40 feet and the 1.25 FAR and so forth?
No, this one does not have a benefits scale. There is no opportunity for increasing density above the maximum densities allowed in the zone.
That's fabulous. That's reassuring, actually. And then the second part that I've noticed is that there are some very large parcels like Kenwood Country Club and Chevy Chase Country Club, and no doubt others, that are upzoned under this plan. And again, same maximums apply to those as well. You couldn't put up, apartment. I mean, how dense can you go on an enormous site like that? And does including those sites in a ZTA, is that problematic?
I've got two responses. The first is that the density, the maximum density, the maximum height, the setback limitations, lot coverage, those don't change because a site is bigger.
Okay.
They remain the same. And then, of course, the other is that in order for those to develop, the property owner needs to sell to a developer who wants to develop.
Yeah. Okay. So that means no problem, or in other words, will the developer...
Only if you, did you say Chevy Chase Country Club?
Yeah, Chevy Chase
That one
Country
of,
Club.
yeah, only if you think they're going somewhere in the near future, which I think is unlikely.
I have a
Okay.
comment on that, if I could just interject, if you don't mind, just really quickly.
Not at all.
I understand that on these properties, Leanne, I understand from Kenwood that they might be planning, they wouldn't sell to a developer, but now they're entitled to build multifamily homes on
Right.
their property. So they'll find a corner that's not being used and will develop. I think they're planning on developing condos there.
Yeah, and I know the intensity or extent of that hasn't been disclosed. And it could be a small number of condos, and it could be a more significant number of condos, and no one knows. So,
Harry Lamari?
Hi, Michelle. How are you?
Harry, I'm well. How are you tonight?
I'm doing well. Listen, I'm a little bit confused, and hopefully you can help me out here. I've done several subdivisions and a re-subdivision. Now, is this property still going to be considered a Euclidean zone? And before you answer that, or is it a hybrid between a Euclidean and floating zone? Okay. And the reason why I ask that is that in floating zones, the planning board has more subjectivity. So when it comes to things like stormwater management, even heights, parking requirements, anything that's going to be hurtful to the community, they can chime in. Euclidean zones, they're pretty much, the applicant basically can do whatever he wants to as long as it's within the zoning standard. Now, I can envision, a re-subdivision, which legally, if it's a Euclidean zone, they cannot deny it. I can envision a re-subdivision where they build a linear lot of 25 feet on the side street, so they can build all the way up to that 25 feet in the rear section, and then call that a linear urban park, putting maybe a couple of park benches and some trees on that 25 feet. And then they can assemble the properties and build it, as you said, build it wall to wall, basically across the property. And that has its benefits, because if you can assemble, you can have more parking, because you're getting rid of the side yard setbacks on all the interior properties. But that question of whether it's a floating zone or a Euclidean zone or a hybrid, and if it's a hybrid, from a legal standpoint, isn't that an end run around Euclid, Ohio versus what's the name of that?
Euclid, yeah,
Yeah,
1920 something case.
Right. Yeah, but that's the standard.
Right. Well, it is 100% a Euclidean zone.
So it's a
A
hybrid.
floating zone needs to go to the county council for approval. This does not need that. A floating zone isn't applied to a piece of property until it goes through that rezoning application process, and that's a council decision. Everything in here is just established. This zone will apply, once adopted, to those lots that front on corridors. And everything is set out in the zoning text amendment. There's nothing hybrid about it. Nothing goes to the council. It is an optional method, just like optional method cluster or optional method MPDU development. It's modeled in many ways very closely after those two optional methods, and it's flat out Euclidean zone.
So the site plan review is really pro forma. The community has no say. As long as the developer meets the standards of Chapter 59, that's the end of it. The way I see it.
I would agree. There's very little subjective
Right.
judgment to the extent that there's a master plan compliance. But here, when you're talking about these types of lots that are already built, would be redeveloped, there's little master plan nuance to apply.
Right. It's pro forma. All right. Thank you.
I'm muted. Eric Gabler, go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming to speak with us tonight. I live in South Four Corners along University Boulevard, and we're currently engaged in looking at the University Boulevard corridor plan.
Right.
And the question that comes up to me is that I just read the staff report regarding the planning board staff report regarding the more housing now legislation. And they have on pages 5 to 7 a discussion about how does the more housing now relate to the corridor plans. And they make it sound like, well, the corridor plan is fine, but if we do a corridor plan, we look at much more detail and look at transit and everything else. So the decisions made in the corridor plan would be better decisions about land use than something from the county council in the more housing now. And what's troubling about that, it almost sounds like they're posturing themselves to supersede the more housing now densities, which are much lower than what they're looking at for the corridor plan for University Boulevard. And if you look at the interactive map for the more housing now, many of the corridors they look at, or the boulevards that are considered in the interactive map, overlap the sort of what they call the enhanced transit systems. And so it almost looks like they plan to override all the county council's decisions with much more dense housing as they complete the corridor plans. Do you have any opinions about that?
I do. The University Boulevard corridor plan is well underway. Closer to completion than the start. The Montgomery County Planning Board just initiated the Georgia Avenue corridors plan, And in looking at it, and it looks to me like it is going to perhaps run the length of Georgia. I'm not sure. I wasn't entirely clear to me. And I do think that the council is going to turn to corridor plans and start to apply them in the same way they have in the university corridor plan. The benefit of that, as you note, is that it's a master plan process. There's community input. You look at communities and properties on a much more granular level than has happened with ZTA 2502. The end result, though, is that I think that you generally are going to wind up with significantly higher densities. It will not surprise me one bit if some of the corridors that right now are the subject of ZTA 2502 ultimately will be redeveloped under a corridor plan. I don't see this as being mutually exclusive.
Just
I don't know if that answered your question, but that's my instinct on where I think things are headed. I think corridor plans are the future.
So in effect, the more housing now for mostly the eastern part of the county would just be a temporary placeholder until they got to the corridor plans.
I think it's an interim step. I think there are some places where it's going to be the final step, but I think in some others, it is an interim step. That's just my personal view. Just
Okay, Slobodan. Slobodans. I probably didn't say that right, but can you unmute yourself, Slobodan?
Yes. Hi. My property is at Westmoreland Hills, and I have a statement and then actually I have a question, right? I try hard to be as diplomatic as all other speakers were, although, if I slip, this is sort of a new area for me. So if I slip somewhere along the line of not being as diplomatic as other, I apologize for that, right? So I did a research, right? And based on the research and impact of this type of switch in zoning has actually several undisputable effects, right? One is that our properties will probably lose between 5 and 30% of its value. So each and every owner of the property needs to be aware of the fact that their property is probably going down the road, right? Which means actually in a very near future, as soon as they're disenacted, right, is going to start losing the value. I did another research, right? So that's one, right? I mean, in terms of the losing value of the property, right? Then traffic congestion, strain on the infrastructure, all the things that have already been mentioned, right? That's by itself is going to bring actually sort of a reduction in or decline in the value of our properties, right? So that's probably the fact that can be sort of what's the right word, camouflaged by other sort of benefits, right? That are potentially given to the owners of the property. But keep in mind, each and every owner on this call, your property will lose the value. That's one sort of statement, right? The other statement is sort of just a curiosity, right? I mean, are we rearranging chairs on the Titanic? Has this already been decided? And this is just a checkbox that someone needs to check in order actually to go through this process and complete this process. And another thing, actually, so that I'm not sort of, if you will, characterized as an elitist, right? I did simple calculation. I calculated the zero value of the properties that are currently in these corridors, right? Without actually taking impact on the other properties. And I was not able to come up with a reasonable economical actually calculation that would actually justify some statements that that's the way to build actually low price or reasonably priced properties, right? So in other words, we will lose the properties, we will lose the value of our properties without really providing any value to the stated goals of this initiative. So, as a final question, where are we in this process? I mean, how can we organize actually to stop this nonsense? How can we actually, is there any way, or is it too late already, right? Do we have a critical mass? Have we disseminated this information to the people so that they can organize, for example, create some action committee, build the flyers, petitions, contact officials, spread awareness, engage media? Is it too late for that? Are we on Titanic and we're just rearranging chairs and talking about, this width, 10 feet, so 11 feet, so, this driveway, that driveway, this parking lot, that parking lot, which is really nonsense if you take into account the whole initiative. Thank you. Thanks for taking and thanks for bearing with me.
I can reply to that if that's okay, Michele. Slobodan, this is Rebecca Hansen. I'm co-president of the Westmoreland Citizens Association, and we have been informing the community and building an action plan. So if you'd like to talk about that offline, we can, but I encourage you to read the electronic email newsletters that we've been sending out.
I read the letter, and I'm very well aware of. Unfortunately, I received that, and I don't know if other people, and I don't know if we're ready actually to have petitions and disseminate information and take really action versus being just information dissemination, right? I mean, we need action, not information dissemination. I'm sorry.
And I also, to follow on to that, we're pretty far into the process. The council, I think, has not given a reasonable amount of time for people to understand this very technical bill. It certainly has not given time for civic and homeowner associations to understand it and coordinate with their own communities. The bill was introduced, I think, on the first week or so of February, but it was several weeks after that before the map was published. And frankly, until the map was published, in a lot of ways, the bill didn't make much sense to people because you really didn't know what we were looking at. So in terms of timing, I think one thing that would be important would be to ask the council to either postpone its current public hearing or schedule a follow-up public hearing so that people do have an opportunity to reasonably understand the bill. That having been said, there are 11 council members, 6 of them are sponsors. So it would be extraordinarily unusual for a council member to withdraw sponsorship. I think that one of the more effective advocacy tools that you have is to take those elements of the bill that trouble you the most and look for modifications before it's adopted. But if you're just going to read the tea leaves, unless something really, something that's hard for me to see blows up, this looks to me like they're going through the process. They're going to listen to the community. There may be modifications. I frankly expect that there will be amendments. It's hard for me to see that this bill is going to be outright defeated. Stranger things have happened, though. I'm just here to try to give you my candid views.
Thank you.
We just need actually some what's the name? The boat to be saved from the Titanic, right? I mean, maybe we can be in some movie later,
and the community was very, very outspoken on the attainable housing, and really achieved a significant pullback in that effort. So again, I'm not saying it's impossible. It certainly is, but this is a much more limited initiative. And it's been formally introduced, and we have 6 sponsors. We're in a different position with respect to this legislation.
Yeah, I just will say here that the process has really been very difficult. And what you mentioned, they didn't release the map right away, but you couldn't get planning to answer questions because they didn't write it.
Right.
So I asked some questions. They said we're only just starting to study it ourselves. When I asked council staff, I got one or two answers. One they had to change later in the day because it was wrong. And then after that, they said you're going to have to go to the information sessions. At the information sessions, you can only ask one question. So I thought certainly by now planning staff must understand the bill. And I went back to them last week and asked some questions. And they said, this is not our bill, it's the council's bill. So you're just boxed in every way, trying to get information. And then the hearing's really quick. The Civic Federation did write a letter to the sponsors and Kate Stewart and Will Jawando asking to have this postponed because, civic associations don't meet every week or even sometimes not even every month. And to try to, understand it and then translate it to people and then get a position in your civic association that you can testify on is time consuming. Anyway, we were told no, that there'd be no postponement, just figure it out and get to the hearing. So,
and I think that I don't think there's any chance they're going to postpone the March 11th hearing. I think that there are two things that they can do, which would be very reasonable. One would be to hold the record open after the March 11th hearing so that there could be supplemental written testimony provided. I think 30 days isn't too much to ask. Certainly 15 is more than reasonable. And the other would be to schedule a second public hearing. There is no public health emergency, no fiscal emergency. There's no reason why this has to be adopted within, 60 or 90 days. And to give the community an additional 30 days so that you can coordinate with, you don't have the authority to speak for your organizations independently of getting consensus from the people who can authorize you to testify. That seems like a very reasonable thing to ask. And a very easy thing to grant. So I would recommend that everybody who submits written and or verbal testimony make that request. Hold the record open, hold a second public hearing. That's 10 seconds.
That's great. There's been a question pending in the chat for a while. You were talking earlier about no obligation to study impacts of increased density. And someone wants to know, is that also true of the master plans covering the corridors like the University Boulevard corridor plan?
They can adopt this text amendment without having to modify the master plan. There was a lot of testimony in connection with attainable housing, and I think it would be logical to look at the master plans in this context. But that's what they're doing with their the more intense upzonings associated with the corridor plans.
Okay, John Holden, is that the question that you think that you and Harriet were asking? John Holden, did I get the question right?
Hey, John Ratner.
Yes.
Yes, okay. All right, looks like we have Leanne and then Liz Joyce.
Yes, I am truly confused about the relationship between this More Housing Now bill and the corridor plans like University Boulevard that have been barreling forward, which apparently will create much more density than would be created by More Housing Now. And I'm sort of embarrassed to ask this question, but it's quite clear that this is a huge issue. And maybe you can recap what is going on here and what the differences are.
Sure. The corridor plans that is a formal master plan process. And for example, the University Boulevard plan, they're looking at significant upzoning. They're looking at multifamily along this corridor, several blocks long, and it is its own initiative, and it was started months ago, perhaps several years ago. I think that the zoning text amendment that's been introduced is sort of a nibble at trying to achieve some of what the Attainable Housing Strategy Initiative was trying to achieve, which is introduce different kinds of housing units in existing neighborhoods. It's a different approach. It's a different thing entirely. I do think that there are corridors that right now are going to be rezoned as part of this pending zoning text amendment that ultimately might be gobbled up into a master plan, a corridor master plan. But they're two very different things. The master plans are one thing that's going to happen sequentially along different parts of the county. And this one, I think, is just sort of piecemealing part of what they hoped to achieve with the attainable housing strategy. I don't know if that answered your question clearly.
Well, it almost sounds to me like a diversionary tactic to supplant AHSI while barreling forward on much more unpopular density plans that are already in progress.
Could very well be.
Okay, that's really important.
I'm not sure how many people, how many questions still remain. If there's time, and I'd like to try and end by about 8:30, but I don't, want to cut this off unduly. But there were a couple of recommendations in the planning staff report on this zoning text amendment that I thought it would be helpful to bring to your attention. One of them, for all that we've maligned the site plan review process, staff is recommending that it be eliminated. That that it be either eliminated entirely, so it could, I think, go straight to building permit, or that it be replaced with a staff level only administrative review. That truncates the process. That takes the community out of the process. Even with an administrative review, if you happen to know an administrative plan has been filed and you can persuade staff that there's some issue that merits planning board level review, you can get that to the planning board. To the extent that people think a site plan review is not helpful, this might not be an issue. If you think that having at least an opportunity for advance notice, signage, a public hearing is helpful, then you would want the council to keep that site plan level review in the bill. Another is, again, is just to clarify that the front lot line must abut a corridor. And the one that I think, frankly, is the most significant for existing communities is the staff recommendation that the number of parking spaces be reduced from 2 lots to 1 on site. So I just wanted to highlight those recommendations from staff that I think might be of particular concern within existing communities.
Catherine Davies, quick question. We don't have much time.
I have a question regarding the map and regarding the lots on the map that are owned by the county, which are designated as available. What does that mean? If a developer comes to the county and says, I want the map, I want the lot on which the Little Falls Library is sitting, what happens then? What does it mean for a space to be available?
I think what they mean is that it would qualify for redevelopment under this zone if it were sold to a developer. Now, if it's a county-owned piece of property, the county has a process that you have to follow in order to dispose of property to a builder or to anybody for that matter. And typically you have to show that it's not currently in public use, that it's not needed for public use. Before they can sell to a private entity, they have to make it available to all of the other county and state agencies that potentially have an interest in it. It's difficult for me to see that would be an easy site to redevelop just because of what the county would have to go through to dispose of that land.
Okay. Well, that's encouraging.
So apparently I got Harriet's question wrong. She says, to clarify, you said for this ZTA, they're not required to study impacts. Are they required to study impacts for rezoning and master plans?
They're not required to per se, but the master plan process itself involves a much more detailed analysis. There is an environmental review of, what are the environmental resources? What are the environmental features? What do we want to protect?
We'll do that.
There is an analysis of the streets. Does the street grid work properly? Should some streets be closed? Should maybe there be a new street in the middle of a block? It's a much more holistic look at a community. And so whereas technically there's, you not an obligation for these kinds of studies per se, because of the nature of the master plan process itself, those studies occur on some level. That analysis happens.
Leanne Tobias. Leanne.
I to unmute. Okay, number one, just to comment on Little Falls Library. When the Westford plan was being developed, there was at one point a proposal that the planning board actually recommended, which was to knock down the library, put up a very large multifamily tower, and build the library into the base of the tower, so the two uses would be integrated. In this case, they wouldn't be able to build a large tower, but I will say that doesn't mean that you can't do something that integrates the library with additional housing, especially because Westland Middle School is also publicly owned and abuts that site. So I just don't want to say that that is all that untenable an option. My question is something else. With respect to MPDUs and workforce housing, is the requirement, if there are 20 or more units, 15% workforce plus 15% MPDU, or one or the other?
It is solely the workforce housing, 15% workforce housing. There is no obligation to provide MPDUs as part of this bill.
Okay, so that would wipe out for a development of 20 more units, the MPDUs.
Well, that's a good question. I have been assuming that it's unlikely that they're going to get to 20 units.
But what if they assemble lots and do it? What if they can assemble multiple lots and get to 20?
Right.
I can't
Leanne, that's a very good question. I'll need to look at that and get back to you. There is not I'll put it this way, there is not an exemption from the MPDU requirements in this bill. So if they hit that threshold, my initial answer to your question is yes, they would need to do both.
Okay.
John Ratner has having trouble get his hand up, but go ahead and speak, John Ratner.
I'm trying to unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes.
Okay. I guess listening to all this, one thing strikes me which is that the train seems almost to be leaving the station. This is in line with what Slobodan said earlier. Given that, two things seem to be important. One is that, as Michele indicated, that conveying to the council that a second public hearing or follow-on would be desirable, might be a way to get more opportunity for homeowner and citizen reactions to be brought into the process. The second is that Michele said that focusing on modifications to the existing planned legislation would be important. I think that requires that there be people who are knowledgeable enough and engaged enough in this, not me, to be able to review those things, to pull together some of the things that seem to be most salient in terms of the impact on the community, and then to prepare selected modifications. Maybe those could be delegated to, in effect, some subcommittees, a couple of people per modification or whatever. In any case, I think this is something where I would think that the various homeowner association, neighborhood associations could take the lead. It's a little hard on a Zoom call like this to coordinate something like that, but I hope that people will be picking up on that who are informed and able to act. Thanks.
Okay, and Rohit, you're going to have the last question, and we only have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Michele, I have a question on process. The payment in lieu of taxes for affordable housing, it's a bill, not a ZTA. So could you clarify what's the difference in process here? And does it mean that Mark Eldridge could veto this and not the ZTAs? Or is there any difference in what Mark Eldridge's position might be as the county executive between the ZTA legislation and this expedited bill, since they have different formats?
Sure, I do think he would have veto authority over the taxing bill. That can be overridden with, I believe, a supermajority of the council. So that is a possibility.
Clarify, what is a supermajority? How many do they need for that?
I would have to look, to be honest. It's been a long time since I've looked at how to override a council veto, and frankly, the number of council members has changed since I last looked into it.
That's fine. Thank you very much.
Cheryl, can you announce tomorrow's meeting?
Sure, but I think we're going to say thank you first to Leanne, who I think has to go. I appreciate you very much, Leanne. You've been a rock for us here at the Civic Federation. So we'll let you go now and keep doing all your good work. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
For everyone else who's here tomorrow night, we have Councilmember Jawando coming. I think he's going to talk about this package of bills, all 4 of them. He seems to have a lot of concerns, one being with the tax holiday for office to residential conversion in particular. I understand he finds that the word offensive was used to me. So we will hear from him, and I imagine he'll talk a little bit about housing generally and where he thinks this conversation should be going and where he thinks the council should be going. He is the 3rd member of the PHP committee, and he's the one that's not a co-sponsor of this CTA. The other 2 members of that subcommittee are Andrew Friedson, who's the chair, and Natalie Fanny Gonzalez. And those 2 are the original sponsors. I can tell you now, I just found out today that Andrew Friedson requested an opportunity to come here and speak, and he'll be coming on March 25th. Sorry, the 24th, Monday the 24th at 7 p.m. I have not put out a notice. There's no Zoom link. We will get that out tomorrow sometime to you all. It'll be the same format, a speaker and then an opportunity to ask questions. It's a possibility that Natalie Fanny Gonzalez will come to a meeting. I did not realize that there's some ethics rule. They both can't appear at this, they cannot appear at the same meeting together because they're on the same committee. So I had been hoping to put them together, and so that's not going to happen. So that conversation is still ongoing, and I'll let you know how that goes. So we can talk a little bit now. This is not really a representative sample, and I know we have a lot of guests here tonight who are not delegates or their association's not a member yet. We'd love to have you join the Civic Fed. But we can talk here a little bit tonight. I'd like to start with people who are delegates from a neighborhood because you're the ones hearing in your neighborhood what people think and what's going on. what approach, we should be taking in testimony. I think Michele made some good suggestions about the planning board. But on the 11th, I'm going to testify on behalf of the Civic Federation. I certainly will be saying something about the process because I think was kind of outrageous, to be honest. But different communities, I guess it's Leanne here, she brought this up with me today. Different communities are approaching it different ways. Some are saying, okay, these parts are good, but we want these parts changed. Some communities are saying the underlying basis, and there's too much undone research and work, the assumptions are wrong. You need to really just pause this and go back and do a whole bunch of work before you move forward. It's sort of a different kind of approach. I'm guessing there are probably some communities that will just say no to this. I don't think that's a great strategy myself, but I thought I would open this up to a little bit of discussion. We don't have a lot of time, but I think we could discuss a little bit what you think your neighborhood wants, and how you see the Civic Federation being helpful to you. So we'll use electronic hands. You can also wave at me. And does anyone want to start? David, go ahead. David, you put
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
Okay, so I just think that I agree that the process has not been good, and it's being rushed, and there doesn't seem to be any reason for the rush. I am the president of the Wingate Citizens Association, but at this point only speaking for my own personal self. But I would like to say some of the comments I've heard from the neighbors when I've been posting all these informations on our neighborhood listserv. And there was one or two people who said they think it's great because we need more workforce housing. And there was other people who really, one person said he was against the 25-year tax holiday. And I talked to somebody who doesn't live in our neighborhood at all, but who has been involved in. He was an architect, and he said that 25-year tax holiday is a giveaway, and I, you know, I question the motivation behind all of this, and I'm not. Our neighborhood association decided not to take a formal position because we would need to hold a meeting and get a vote. And even then, the only way we can notify people of the meeting is through our listserv, and not everyone in the neighborhood is on the listserv. So your point about, neighborhoods don't have time to react, I think is a good one. And it just seems like this is being rushed through. I'll stop there.
Okay, David Foreman. David, we can't hear you.
Just to let you know, answering the specific question, the Citizens Coordinating Committee on Friendship Heights is taking the position that this must be paused for more information, and we'll be filing testimony written by Leanne Tobias in the next day or so. As I said, we strongly think that there are just too many questions.
Okay, anyone else? Carrie, do you have your hand up for that?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
I've actually developed a couple of subdivisions and small subdivisions, and I'm very familiar with the Chapter 15, Chapter 59. Chapter 50 is your subdivision regulations, and Chapter 59 is your zoning text amendments. Okay, those are the standards that we talk about, setbacks and heights and all those things. Now, the way I see this, first of all, I don't see how you can possibly have a hearing unless you take a look at all of the of these zones in Chapter 59 and look at what the differences are. Okay, what the setbacks are in the different zones. And then secondly, you may want to consider, I would take the position A, that we need more time. I mean, to do a proper evaluation. Even the staff has not done that. Then B, my backup position would be, let's suggest changes to those standards. For example, parking, require that all projects in R40, R60, R90, and R200 have non-impervious driveways. Okay, cost a little bit more, but that allows the water to go penetrate through the driveway into the earth so that you can have, you know, some stormwater mitigation. You can reduce the height requirement if you believe so. You can have a higher green area, require a certain percentage of the lot to remain green, to have trees. You know, have certain standards that you think would benefit the community. Require a linear urban park around all buildings that are over 40 feet. Okay, so that there's like a buffer, a tree buffer, as well as maybe benches along these roadways. I mean, things like that. It costs more to do. It might hesitate a little. It might, you know, scare some developers, not the good ones though. And B, you're building in some protections for the community. But to, you know, I mean, I'm of the opinion that this is going to be a hard one to fight. If it's a Euclidean zone, Amber Realty versus Euclid, Ohio, I mean, this is an end run around that. And I think they're going to succeed, unfortunately. That's my opinion.
Okay, Slobodan. Can't hear you.
I would just actually support the idea of asking for a little bit more time, right? In the meantime, since I heard about this late, yesterday I built actually one flyer and I distributed that flyer to about 60 dwellings, 60 houses. I plan to distribute additional 200, you know, as we're going forward. I plan to have a flyer and petition in front of the meeting, and distribute to the people that are ready on the 11th, right? I think that we should have action committee if we buy a little bit more time, and that action committee should actually, you know, really try to articulate actionable items that we can take between now and finally, you know, accepting the results, right? And make sure that we put our best foot forward with our arguments and that we make really informed decision, and then each and every homeowner has a chance actually to understand what is really behind this and makes informed decision. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with you on more time, and I know how hard it is to organize within a neighborhood, particularly if it's in a big neighborhood. And, you know, we do have a diversity of viewpoints in the Civic Federation. So we have to try to figure out where the areas of consensus are. Fortunately, our white paper on housing, which if anyone hasn't seen it, is posted on our website under resolutions. And also our resolution on attainable housing is posted there. Gives us, you know, as we write our testimony, a lot of guidance in terms of what we've said we want in terms of approaches and what we said we're, you know, concerned about. That will help. Joyce, your hand's up. Go ahead. Nope, you're paused.
Yeah, I got it. I had to get over there to do it. One of the things that I think we need to include is the question of the consolidation and aggregation of lots. To me, that's a very big one. Whether we stop, whichever approach we take, that needs to be addressed in this, because it's a huge hole to you know, send the trucks through to put a large apartment complex on any of these places.
Yeah, I agree. John Holden.
Thanks, Cheryl. A general comment that with respect to the message of no versus, well, we like this, but, and so on. Anyone who's observed the county council's behavior over the years knows that if the statement indicates, well, we support it, but the council is only going to hear the support part. And uh, I suggest that your message indicates strongly that you all indicate clearly all the different ways that we want to engage with them to get more information and and the like. So that's all. That was the main thing. And I think there are a lot of questions about how successful this is going to be. How affordable is this workforce housing actually going to be? And why have existing programs not provided a much greater number of affordable homes for those who need them the most? I think those are reasonable questions to ask because this plan, like so many others, have lots of very aspirational goals that appear to be very positive, but the details matter. Thanks, Cheryl.
Yeah, I mean, I think also the issue of the pipeline is really important. Planning just announced that they've hired someone to sit and go through all of the old approvals and try to help them find out why they're not being built. You know, residents have been testifying that, including me, since, you know, Thrive was passed and then the Silver Spring and adjacent communities. And we were always just dismissed on that. The other thing that bothers me is Jason Sartori came out with some analysis that said this huge number of these approvals are over, I forget what number, but like, let's say over 15 years old. So that it's not realistic to think that they're going to be built. And I think Natalie Fanny Gonzalez has jumped on that bandwagon. However, what they didn't do is look at that group and see, have these builders put in amendments to the plans more recently. So for example, we have a garden apartment complex at 16th and East West Highway called Falkland Chase. It's quite old. There is a plan that's probably 25 years old that was approved and it's just been sitting there. But more recently, about 2 or 3 years ago, the owners put in a new plan to develop it into high rises. So it's not as stale as they would have us believe. And I think that does take a little bit of work to get the precise data that we want from planning, to ask it in such a precise way that they can't put out shady numbers like that. But I think if you look at the planning did a report on Pike and Rose, asking the question why the uptake on approved housing was so slow. And the answer that the developers gave was because our future job protections didn't justify going any faster. I think that may be as well the case for White Flint. So if you can't get the big guys to do the big stuff, I guess they want to chip away at little stuff, is just what I'm guessing is kind of where this is coming from. We have to kind of wrap our arms somehow around the notion of job projections and when housing moves forward and try to get at that. It looks like, Jerry, you have your hand up. Go ahead, Jerry.
One of the things that came up in our meeting of our executive committee of our local neighborhood association the other night is that there probably are going to be a large number of houses that go on the market probably in the next 2 or 3 months. But basically, most of these federal workers were not anticipating being laid off. And if you want to get your house sort of ready to put it on the market, it probably takes a minimum of 60 days. Shouldn't we wait till after we see how many people in this area are losing their jobs, how many people are moving out? And a lot of this will be people who intend to move out, but are waiting till the end of the school term. So we should definitely wait at least till July 1st before we make any decisions and relook at what the real estate market is. I think in this county, we're going to create a quantity of more affordable housing. I'm not saying attainable housing. I'm not saying affordable, but more affordable. Everyone in our neighborhood and other people who I've spoken to all seem to think that real estate will start falling within the next 2 or 3 months, if not sooner. But basically, a lot of this will not occur till July 1st. If you had a house full of what I call junk, it takes you a couple of weeks just to throw out the junk or donate it. So these houses are going to take a little while to come on the market. Why are we trying to do this in the middle of a major layoff of federal workers?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Hope you put that in your testimony, Jerry. Paul Jarozinski.
Yeah, thanks, Cheryl. First off, I'll say I agree with Jerry and I agree with you what you just said, Cheryl. Jobs is the central part for why a lot of those houses aren't being built. Mark Eldridge has said the same thing. I'm looking at my calendar. I was at a meeting yesterday about information on this plan. I heard Michele Rosenfeld speak tonight. Tomorrow night I have Jawando. The next night I have Fanny Gonzalez. The next night I have Friedson talking. I mean, here it is a week before the hearing, and people are still handing out information and answering questions. How am I supposed to call a meeting of my HOA when we're still getting new information? So I'm echoing your comment that this is happening much too fast to actually go back to the association and give them the reliable details about what's going on with this plan.
Yeah, I agree. It's and what's the big hurry? Why do we have to have this hearing in March? Why did they have to introduce it when they didn't even have a map, when they couldn't even answer questions, when planning hadn't done an analysis of it? You know, when they introduced it early that way, they started the clock. By statute, you have to have a hearing within between 30 and 60 days after introduction. So they introduced it without all the information, no explainer, no planning analysis, started the clock. And then they set the hearing. Although they could have pushed it a few more weeks, they still had more time. But then they started the clock and pushed the hearing out and then dribbled the information out. And it's, I feel like we've been railroaded. Sherry, your hand's up. Go ahead.
For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sherry Steisel-Weiss. I'm the president of the Lux Manor Citizens Association, which is Lux Manor, Windermere, and the Oaks on between Tilden Lane and going almost to 495 off Old Georgetown Road, including Tuckerman. And we have 900 households. And we rejoined Civic Fed, and I'm excited to be a part of it because this has been invaluable in terms of getting ourselves up to speed. I share with all of you that this has been incredibly hard to express to our community what's going on and the implications, in part because some of the interpretations have changed over the last week. So it's very frustrating. I share everybody's frustration. I do think that has to be part of what is said. I don't think it's going to slow them down. I think they have a mindset of wanting to pass something so they can say they've done something in this new area of workforce housing that's called attainable housing a couple weeks ago, and that's really where their focus is. But I think at the same time, we have to attack some of the specifics. So whether it's stormwater, which has been an issue that we've been raising in all of the Friedson calls, and particularly the impact if you're going to really wipe away for the multifamily houses to not have any kind of requirement. And we're a community that's suffered from a lot of flooding, from a lot of the construction that's been going on all around our neighborhood. And so we have a story to tell. We'll tell that story in the hearing. But I have to say, I think there are other things like traffic, like infrastructure, that I think all of us need to hit on hard in this testimony, and that Cheryl, in your testimony, some of those areas just need to be hit on, because I think that's our best place for getting amendments. So to some extent, even if we say no, 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 I think we have to have an amendment strategy at the same time. So I'll just stop there.
I agree. Irving Lieberman.
Yeah, I wanted to mention that there's been comments that one reason that White Flint may not have been built out, which could accommodate many, many units, is that the county has been requiring high-rise construction, and that at current market pricing, the developers, it's very expensive to put up high-rise construction, and that they've asked for a reduction in density to build what would be for them more affordable to construct, and the county has held out and refused to modify that requirement. And so the property sits. So I know you mentioned before there might be things going on between the private parties, but the public sector is also involved in that standstill as well.
Yeah, the same has happened at Pike and Rose. There was a high-rise sited there that just put in amendments to their plans to build townhouses instead. So I think the market is shifting and it's not what they thought it was. John Ratner.
There, can you hear me?
Yes.
First, listening to the conversation this evening, I'm struck with how extraordinarily rational everybody is, and a brief round of applause for that. However, there's the question is, are we broadcasting on the frequency that the people we're trying to persuade are receiving on, which is often WIIFM, what's in it for me? I don't know what the 6 co-sponsors of this legislation think they're advancing when they do this. And so I don't really know what it is that, how to try to appeal to them. So I don't know whether there's any thought that can go into that.
I think what I'm told from within the council is just, we're starting to get into county executive race politics, and that, they're looking for, some of these council members are looking for a win. We do have a decently vocal group of urbanists and YIMBYs in this county that wanted attainable housing and they didn't get it. And so passing something and kind of satisfy them and is a win for some of the council members. The answer to that is, to be able to convey to them it's not the win that you think it is. And I just think we have to be careful, because in a lot of ways, this is a much, much dialed back plan from what was in attainable housing. And so I think there has been an effort made to dial it way back and to keep it actually on the corridors and out of the neighborhoods. Although I have to be careful saying that. I know some of you feel, and I agree, the houses on your corridors are also part of your neighborhood. They're not something else. And I think that's the way some people like to talk about it, is it's not in your neighborhood, it's just there on the edge. And we also have houses on Georgia Avenue, and we think of them as part of the Woodside community. But I think that's it. I think a lot of this is political, to tell you the truth. Someone's just joining now. I think a lot of this is political, and so I think the answer is political. Carrie, go ahead.
I think you're absolutely right, Cheryl. I mean, this is all political. They've got to get it done before they start their campaigning. But I think the biggest message we need to send this council is that Montgomery County needs jobs. We need jobs. The fact of the matter is, unless we have jobs, we're not going to have enough buyers, enough market to fill these up. And then the second point I want to make is this development isn't really to build housing. It just isn't. It's to build rental units. It's to build apartments, condos. Well, probably apartments. I don't even think it's going to be condos. If you think about it, even the pilot program, if it's a tax abatement, that's for the landowner. He's going to get 25 years of tax abatement. He's going to get a paycheck. That's going to help him pay for the equity that he's building. So I think the big point we need to point out is, A, we don't have the jobs. We're not going to have the jobs for another 20 years, it looks like. B, we're heading into tough times with the federal government, and we're going to have a lot of resales on our hands. So I thought that was a very good point that someone brought up. It's not the right time for this proposal. Although, and you may want to point out, guys, we're going to remember this while you're campaigning. This is going to be a big issue. And just because you think you're going to approve it this year, we're not going to forget. I mean, and I think the public has to make that up. But going back to what Miss Sneary said, and I said earlier, we've got to have a backup plan, and that is standards that we can live with. Because, in the end, we could lose.
If anyone has suggestions for those things, amendments and standards, please send them to me. I totally understand the discussion that's happening about elections and political. Go for it, whatever you think. All of our members should get in there and say whatever they think. The Civic Fed can't actually weigh in that way on elections. So, I have opinions, but they won't be testified to. So let's see, Rohit and then Deborah.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to say I agree on this question of jobs and the impact of the federal cuts. I think what's interesting to note, just for those who intend to testify on this issue, that what the county needs is to create jobs, is just to remind everybody that all the way from our governor down to Andrew Friedson and in between the state controller have the opposite narrative. What they say is that what's preventing people from moving to Montgomery County is high housing costs. And I have repeatedly written to Wes Moore, to Andrew Friedson, telling them this is garbage. If Maryland ranks at the bottom of job creation, who is going to move to a state where you don't have jobs? Never mind the housing. So I think just for those of you who are crafting a testimony on this point, it's just useful to remember that this this orthodoxy about jobs is completely backwards for some reason in I'm sorry to say, all the way up to the governor's office. And I think it's important for those who want to touch it to really rebut this very forcefully, that the economics is exactly the opposite. I just can't believe we don't have good economists in the state government, but that's a different matter. Thank you.
Okay, Deborah, go ahead.
Hi, so I will say this. We were very lucky that Council Member Mink actually came and spoke to us about the attainable housing strategies, and that galvanized quite a bit of our community here in good old District 5 to let her know that we were against the attainable housing just completely. And she changed from, well, I'm not committed and maybe it needs more study, and she came out against it. As did Council Vice President Jawanda, who came in a subsequent meeting and spoke to us with Council Member Meg. They initiated, not our civic association. Much like you, we can't have them to get the whole 9 yards. But we did have a lot of success with him as well in terms of letting them know how we feel, especially here. I'm Four Corners is not far, and I used to be there all the time too. But and some of the misquoting and misrepresentation of the cost of housing is also something we may want to bring up. An average is not a useful number.
Right. It's median.
It's just not useful.
They're supposed to be the median. Yeah.
Exactly. And even still, it's like, well, and what are we talking about? Are we talking about a 5-bedroom huge house, or are we talking starter homes, missing middle kind of idea? Starter homes, three bedrooms, small homes. So that's what we did. We spent a lot of time on that. I don't know how helpful or useful that will be with the other council members because we didn't really hear back from any of the other ones that we contacted. So hopefully, I don't know if that'll help. And I've been away on vacation. So much happens when you're away. To sign up to testify, it will probably be as myself, as again, we don't have time to meet. I don't even have my board meeting till the end of the month.
If anybody hasn't signed up, you need to do it. I understand they opened up the daytime session again today. It had been showing wait list, but you don't want to wait so long that you don't get a spot. Okay, it's 9 o'clock. David, you're going to get the last word, and that's it.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
I just noticed in reading through some of the staff report from the planning staff that at least this is very complicated, I will say, and it's hard for the rest of us to understand this who are not developers or land use attorneys. But I saw something that said that when they get these tax breaks or whatever for workforce housing, they only have to be required to have this percentage of quote unquote workforce housing for a certain limited period of time. So, like, I don't know if it's 10 years or 15 years or whatever. And after that, I guess it can flip to market.
Uh-oh, let me mute
So
somebody. All right,
that should be fleshed out, I think.
yeah. Okay. All right. If you want a copy of this recording to view again, you have to email me and ask for it. I'm not going to post it publicly. We had a little bit of trouble. People who, oh, I'm not going to get into it. We're not going to publish this publicly, but you can write to me and ask for it, and we'll make it available to anyone who's here or not here tonight if they ask for it. Try to come back tomorrow. I know there's a lot of meetings and this is exhausting and aggravating. But I think tomorrow night we can hear some different ideas, different approaches, some different criticisms of these bills. I think it's important to do. So I hope that you come back tomorrow. If any of you are here from a civic association that's not a member of the Civic Fed, welcome. We like having you here as a guest, but please consider joining. How effective we are depends upon how big we are, frankly. And the stronger we build, the better off we can represent everyone. So I think that's it. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow night. Good night.